Hello, I'm Doug Bamford, tutor for the course Political Economy of Taxation. And I've got several questions for you in this video. The first is, do you like Jaffa cakes? I prefer Tunnock's tea cakes myself to the humble Jaffa cake. The second question I'm going to ask is whether a Jaffa cake is indeed a cake or if it's a biscuit. It has cake in the name, but so does a cake of soap, and indeed the rock band Cake. But of course those two are neither cake nor biscuit, and I certainly wouldn't recommend eating either of them. But who cares whether Jaffa cakes are cakes or biscuits? Surely they taste the same, whatever we call them. Nevertheless, when you do think about it, it is quite tough to decide which one they are. However, in the United Kingdom, it certainly matters to the makers of the product. It also matters to retailers and to those people who eat them, and maybe even to everyone, even people like me who don't even buy them and like them. And it mattered enough that there was a legal tribunal about this very question in 1991. And that case ruled that Jaffa cakes are indeed cakes, despite their various similarities to chocolate-covered biscuits. If you're interested, the reasoning that settled the case was that Jaffa cakes go hard when they go stale, like a cake, whereas biscuits go soft when they go stale. But it was certainly a very close one. So why does this matter then? Well, the reason it matters is that food is zero rated for VAT, whereas confectionery isn't. Cake is classified as a food, whereas chocolate-covered biscuits are considered to be confectionery, and therefore subject to VAT. So, if Jaffa cakes, and indeed Tunnock's tea cakes, are counted as cakes, then they won't be subject to VAT or VAT, and that is currently at 20%. So what are the effects of this difference? Well, it's actually surprisingly difficult to know for sure. However, if the government isn't getting 20% of the purchase price, then someone else is going to get it. This could mean increased profits for the manufacturers, but I think it's more likely that this is going to be passed on in a cheaper product for consumers. So if it's just making things cheaper for consumers, why would the manufacturers care so much about it? Well, I think this is because if their product is cheaper, then they'll be able to sell more of it at this cheaper price. And when they're doing that, then whatever profit they are making on each cake, they're going to be making that on more occasions. So their overall profits will then increase through greater sales, if not greater profit per unit. And why don't you think about this from your own perspective as a consumer? Would it change your decision if you go to the shop, if the price of Jaffa cakes or tea cakes or whatever item went up 20%? Would you maybe consider switching to a different product if the prices of one went up 20% and the other one didn't go up, say chocolate biscuits or cookies, for instance, instead? Would you then think, well, maybe I will get these other chocolate-covered items instead? So why have this difference then? Why do the government want to declare that some items, such as Jaffa cakes, are going to be zero rated in the first place? Surely they would get more revenue, more money to spend on other things if everything was just charged at the same rate of VAT. What the government is looking to do here is to make certain items, including food, cheaper than other luxury and unhealthy goods. And what this means is that food becomes cheaper compared to other items. And when people are in the supermarket, then they might decide to go for the food option rather than something else and then save themselves some money. And Jaffa cakes are just really an example of an edge case where they probably are more like the kind of item that the government wants to tax at a higher rate, but they had to be classified with regular food because of their cake-like feature. So what's the point of this overall then? Why zero rate food? Is it that it's going to improve society more if people have more Jaffa cakes and fewer chocolate cookies? It seems like the aim is possibly to encourage people to buy healthier food, but alternatively we might see this as a way of helping the less well off in society. Consumption taxes, which VAT effectively is, are often regressive. So richer people are more likely to save and invest their income, whereas poorer people are going to tend to spend it all just to get by. So the less well off are therefore spending a higher proportion of their income on food. And so by zero rating food, this reduces the burden on the poorer members of society compared to the rich members of society. And the idea is that this makes VAT a slightly more progressive tax than it would otherwise be. After all, we need to have court cases sometimes to distinguish whether a particular product should be counted in a particular category or another category. There are extra costs for businesses to administer the different rates on different products. When selling products, they have to distinguish the zero rated from the standard rated products. And you can look at your till receipt next time you go to the supermarket to see how your shop does this. What it does mean is that companies need to hire more accountants and VAT experts, and that's all an expense, and they're likely to pass that on to the consumer. And it also makes for a more complex tax authority, meaning that we might need to hire more tax inspectors to make sure that the companies are applying these rules correctly. Or perhaps the government won't hire those inspectors and just hope that the companies do it right. So the question then is, are all these costs worth it in order to ease the burden on the poor or perhaps try and encourage slightly healthier lifestyles? And let's not forget that this tax break on food applies to everyone who buys cold food to eat or to cook themselves. And when we look at the absolute amounts of spending, generally rich people are going to spend more on VAT exempt food than people on lower incomes do. Those on lower incomes will tend to buy cheaper food from cheaper stores, and some poorer people might not have the ability or the facilities in order to cook for themselves as well, in which case they might end up buying a lot of takeaway food, and that is subject to VAT. And the wealthy, of course, also buy food, and in fact, expensive foods from luxury stores also get this tax break. So this is helping rich people as well as poor people. And most rich people are going to spend more on zero rated food than less well off people will. And the rich are almost certainly going to get more benefit from these lower tax rates than the poor will. So if we're looking to help the poor, would it be better to charge VAT on food and then use the revenue to help the less well off in society in other ways instead? Should the government really be encouraging people to buy ready meals rather than eating out? Is cooking for yourself a virtuous activity that the government should be encouraging? So this really gets us to consider the aims of the tax system as a whole, and the blend of taxes that we are going to choose is going to result from our priorities for the tax system. Do we want governments to just raise as much money as possible? Or should they be aiming to raise a certain specified amount of revenue? Do we want to make the economy as large as possible? Do we want an economy that creates as much happiness as possible? Or should our goal for society be one of fairness? And this is something about which people disagree quite a lot. Is fair taxation a matter of sharing the burdens of funding the state equitably? Or is it about creating a fair final distribution of social resources? Or is it about making sure that everyone pays exactly the right amount into the system that they should do? Or should we focus on administrative matters to keep the costs of administering the tax system as low as possible? Or perhaps to spend a bit more, but making that system as easy as possible for the taxpayers themselves? Placing a stronger emphasis on any of these purposes could lead you to prefer a very different profile of taxation and maybe a very different conclusion about VAT. Taxation then is an important matter. After all, it affects us all, and yet people pay surprisingly little attention to it. And perhaps this is because it can be hard to know exactly what the effects of a particular tax will be, let alone the impacts of the tax system as a whole. However, what you can be sure is that special interest groups will know how the tax system works, and they're going to be lobbying hard to make sure that it works well for them. And politicians, even if they're well-intentioned, it might be too much hassle than it's worth for them to try to explain the full impacts if the voters aren't really going to listen, if they're not interested, and if they're not going to really understand how the system works and take the time to work that out. So I think that as citizens and as voters, we really need to know how different tax reforms are going to affect us and how they're going to affect society at large. So, are you confident that you understand your tax system? And what about the advantages and the disadvantages of possible tax reforms that people, perhaps people like me, propose from time to time? So, I hope that I've convinced you with this video that taxation is a really important matter and that it's one that requires quite careful attention and analysis. One way that you can learn more about the tax system is to take my course on the political economy of taxation. And this course is aiming to give you the tools to assess proposed tax reforms, and it would be great to have you on the course.